Story 1. Sometimes you pass through a town that feels like it shouldn't exist on any map. The kind of place where the air is too still, the streets are too empty, and every turn feels like you've gone a little too far off the main road. I found myself in one of those towns late one evening, hungry and tired after a long day working on a location just outside of Dublin. My plan was simple: grab something to eat, maybe a beer, and then keep driving until I found a motel. What I got instead still makes the hairs on my arms stand up when I think about it. The town wasn't marked on my GPS. It was just a cluster of lights I saw off the main road, the kind of place you might pass without giving a second thought. The streets were quiet, no cars parked along the curb, but I noticed a pub at the corner with a chalkboard outside advertising food and drink. I figured I'd lucked out. Small-town pubs usually have the kind of hearty meals that beat any gas station sandwich. I parked just across the road and walked inside, expecting the usual background noise of chatter, laughter, and clinking glasses. At first, it was exactly that. The place was packed, maybe 40 or 50 people squeezed inside, all talking over one another in that comfortable, familiar way locals do. But then something strange happened. As soon as the door shut behind me, every single head turned. Conversations cut off in the middle of sentences. Even the clinking of glasses seemed to stop. I don't mean just a few curious glances either. I mean every person in that pub stopped what they were doing and stared at me. It was one of those moments that stretch far too long to feel normal. I smiled awkwardly and made my way toward the bar, trying to ignore the heavy silence pressing in from all directions. The only sound was my boots against the floorboards, and it echoed way louder than it should have. There was a woman behind the bar holding a steaming plate of food, and I remember noticing the smell of fried meat and chips, so strong it actually made my stomach growl. It gave me a little confidence. If they served food, maybe they'd relax once they realized I was just a hungry traveler. I asked if they had a table. My voice sounded small, like it didn't belong in the room. The barmaid kept holding that plate, not putting it down, not moving, just staring at me with a blank expression. Finally, she said they didn't sell food. I thought maybe I'd misheard her. My eyes flicked down to the plate she was holding, clear as day, chips piled high beside some kind of meat, steam curling upward. There was even another plate waiting on the counter behind her, but when I tried again, more carefully this time, she repeated herself in that same flat tone. They didn't serve food. The whole pub hadn't stopped staring. I tried to laugh it off, muttered something about grabbing a pint instead, but the look she gave me told me that wasn't an option either. I don't know how to explain it except to say there was no anger or hostility in the way she looked at me. Just this cold stillness, like she was looking through me rather than at me. I backed away from the bar and turned toward the door, my stomach tying itself into knots. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved. I could feel their eyes following me as I pushed the door open. The cool air outside hit me hard, and I practically jogged across the street to my car. That should have been the end of it. Just a weird, unfriendly town where outsiders weren't welcome. But it wasn't. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard the pub door creak open behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw 3 men step out onto the street. They didn't call after me. They didn't threaten me. They just stood there shoulder to shoulder, watching. When I finally got the car started, they took a few steps forward, as if to make sure I understood what I needed to do next. So I did. I pulled away from the curb and drove until the town was nothing but darkness behind me. Here's the part that sticks with me. I've tried to find that town again, just to prove to myself that it exists. I've gone back down the same stretch of road more than once, keeping an eye out for the same cluster of lights. But every time there's nothing. No pub, no streets, no chalkboard sign on the corner, just empty road and fields. The logical part of my brain tells me I must have taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere that doesn't show up on GPS. Maybe I just didn't recognize the road when I tried to retrace it. And maybe the people in that pub were just unfriendly locals who didn't want to serve an outsider. But there's another part of me that remembers the way they all stared at me in perfect silence. The food steaming on the counter that supposedly didn't exist, and the men making sure I left without looking back. I can't explain it in a way that makes sense, and I don't know if I ever want to. All I know is that I've driven a lot of lonely back roads since then, and I've never once stopped in a town I didn't already know. Story 2. Back roads have a strange way of making you feel like you've stepped out of time. The main highways are busy, lined with signs and gas stations that keep you tethered to the present. But once you drift off onto some gravel road tucked into the woods, it feels like you're driving into an older version of the world. That's what happened to me when I got turned around on my way to Centralia, Pennsylvania. The place already has a reputation, with its empty streets and smoke rising from underground. So I guessed my nerves were already heightened before I even realized I'd gone the wrong way. The GPS had glitched and rerouted me, claiming there was a faster path up through the mountains. The paved road narrowed into gravel, winding up into heavy woods that swallowed most of the daylight. The climb felt endless, each bend in the road revealing only more trees. My tires crunched over loose rock, the forest pressing tighter on either side. It wasn't until I saw an opening at the top that I finally relaxed a little, figuring I'd reached some kind of lookout or clearing. Instead, I rolled up to a small memorial. There was a well-kept stone marker, flowers, and a plaque dedicated to local firemen. It seemed out of place, perfectly maintained in an area where the road itself looked like it hadn't been driven by many cars. The grass around it was trimmed, the flowers fresh, and the stone polished. Someone clearly cared for the site regularly, but I hadn't passed another vehicle or person since I'd turned off the highway. While I sat in my car reading the plaque, my eyes drifted past the memorial to the tree line behind it. That's when I noticed the house. A tiny wooden cottage sat tucked into the woods, partially hidden by overgrown brush. The sight of it sent a strange ripple of unease through me. It wasn't that the house itself was unusual. It looked like a basic old cabin, the kind you'd expect in rural Pennsylvania. What unsettled me was the way the land around it had been decorated, if you could call it that. Scattered through the trees, hanging from branches and nailed into trunks, were objects, dozens of them. At first I thought it was junk, maybe a dump site, but the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't discarded. They'd been deliberately placed. Stuffed animals, faded and half-rotted, swayed in the breeze, their button eyes missing or their fur peeling off in clumps. Plastic lawn ornaments, warped from age, dangled on wires. A lawn chair hung upside down from a thick branch, rocking back and forth as if someone had just touched it. I scanned further and spotted wooden cutouts shaped like pigs, painted bright once, but now chipped and waterlogged. They weren't just leaned against the trees. They were strapped to the trunks with duct tape and tangled extension cords. Some were nailed directly into the bark, the nails rusting and streaking brown stains down the wood. The whole setup stretched in a wide radius around the cottage, like a strange barrier or shrine. It didn't feel like art. It felt like a warning. The deeper I looked, the more wrong it felt. The stuffed animals weren't just hanging randomly. They were all facing the same general direction, toward the clearing, toward me. Their blackened, weather-worn faces seemed to watch. Even the sunflowers, those tacky plastic lawn decorations that had turned a sickly yellow-brown, looked as if they'd been arranged to stand guard. I should have left right then. Every instinct told me I'd stumbled into someone else's space, and not the kind of space you wanted to intrude on. But curiosity had me frozen, gripping the steering wheel, staring at that cottage. The windows were dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside, standing just out of sight, watching me back. Then the forest went quiet. I hadn't realized until it stopped, but the woods had been alive with sound a moment earlier. Bugs, birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind. All of it ceased at once, leaving an unnatural silence that made the air feel heavier. I glanced at the trees again, and one of the stuffed animals gave a slow turn on its string, like something had brushed past it. The thought hit me hard. Maybe the memorial wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it was connected. Firemen remembered at the well, a strange, guarded cottage right behind it. I couldn't shake the image of them responding to a fire years ago and finding something they weren't supposed to, something that left behind more questions than answers. I wanted to dismiss it as just someone's weird art project, maybe a recluse with eccentric taste, but nothing about it felt playful. The use of extension cords, the way the objects were bound and displayed, it gave the impression of ritual, not decoration. It looked like someone had taken household junk and turned it into talismans, like every single piece was meant to hold something in place. That's when I noticed movement in the cottage. Just a flicker behind the glass of a side window, like a curtain shifting. I couldn't prove it wasn't the wind or my eyes playing tricks, but I didn't wait to find out. The silence of the forest pressed down harder, and the sight of that single dark window locked onto my brain like a target. I put the car in reverse so fast my tires spat gravel, then spun around and barreled down the mountain road. I didn't look back until I was back on the main highway, and even then I half expected to see one of those stuffed animals tied to my bumper, dragged along as some kind of mark. I still don't know what I stumbled into that day. Maybe it was just some reclusive person decorating their land in a bizarre way. Maybe it was nothing more than an unsettling coincidence. A strange yard I took too seriously because I was already spooked from heading toward Centralia. But every time I think about that house, about the way the stuffed animals all seem to face the clearing, I feel the same unease crawl back over me. It wasn't just junk in the trees. It was something deliberate, and whatever it meant, I wasn't supposed to see it. Story 3. Small towns at night have their own kind of silence. It isn't peaceful. It's the kind that makes you feel like you've wandered into a place that forgot about time. I learned this the hard way when I was on my first tour, driving from Phoenix to Austin. I didn't know then how long Texas could stretch, how the roads could eat up hours of your life with nothing but desert and darkness on either side. By the time I hit El Paso, I was already worn thin, and the road seemed to fold in on itself. Past that point, there was nothing but long stretches of highway that made me feel like I wasn't moving forward at all. Somewhere along the way, I got off the interstate, thinking it might be good to break up the monotony with a shortcut, or at least find a gas station. The turnoff dropped me onto a smaller road that wound into what looked like a small town. At first, I thought it was a lucky find. Places like that usually had one or two late-night diners, or at least a gas station where you could stretch your legs. But as soon as I rolled past the first buildings, I felt something was wrong. The streets were empty, not just quiet, but abandoned. No cars parked along the curbs, no movement in windows, not even the flicker of a TV through a curtain. Every storefront I passed was dark, and even the streetlights looked weak, glowing in a dull yellow instead of bright white. I kept telling myself it was late, that small towns shut down early, but the silence carried a weight that didn't feel normal. It was the kind of stillness where you expect to hear a dog bark or a screen door slam somewhere, but nothing ever comes. I drove deeper in, expecting to eventually come across something, a diner, a station, maybe even just a single car rolling by. But the town stayed dead. A few shops had faint lights glowing inside, but they weren't bright enough to be open, more like a forgotten bulb left on for years. I slowed down and stared through the windows of one grocery store, and it felt like stepping back in time. The shelves looked stocked, but not with anything familiar. The labels seemed outdated, like brands I remembered from when I was a kid. The worst part, the part that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it, was the sign. One of the storefronts had painted letters on the glass that said, "Happy Homecoming 2005, in big cheerful writing. The problem was, it wasn't 2005, it was 2008. I remember staring at it so long that I nearly drifted into the opposite lane. My first thought was that maybe no one had updated it. But 3 years. Why would a town leave something like that untouched for that long? It looked fresh too, not like old paint cracking or fading in the sun. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was nothing. But as I drove further, I realized I hadn't seen a single person. Not walking, not driving, not even inside the buildings with the dim lights on. 15 minutes of driving through that place, and it felt like I was the last living person there. The air was heavy, like the whole town was holding its breath. My chest tightened with the feeling that I shouldn't be there, like I'd slipped into a place I wasn't supposed to find. Eventually, I got back on the highway, pushing the gas harder than I needed to. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the entrance to that little town was already swallowed up by the dark, no sign it had ever been there. I didn't stop driving until I hit the next big city. For a long time after, I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion. 18 hours on the road will do strange things to your mind, and maybe I imagined half of it. But no matter how many times I go over it, I can't explain how a whole town could feel so completely dead while still looking lived in. That empty silence has stuck with me ever since, like I stumbled into some kind of place that wasn't meant for me. A place that still thinks it's homecoming week 3 years in the past. Story 4. Small towns always carry a certain kind of silence, the kind that feels thicker than the quiet you find anywhere else. When I first drove through Rulo, Nebraska, I remember thinking the stillness felt wrong, almost staged, like a movie set where everyone had walked off between takes. It wasn't just the boarded-up buildings, the leaning fences, or the paint peeling in long strips from houses that hadn't seen a fresh coat in decades. It was the weight in the air, heavy enough that I caught myself rolling down the window just to breathe easier, as if the glass could keep out whatever lingered there. I hadn't gone there for thrills. I was driving through on my way south, cutting time off the highway by taking back roads. A guy I'd met at a gas station in Falls City warned me not to linger in Rulo after dark. He said it casually with a grin, but his tone had an edge to it, like he meant it more than he wanted me to know. I brushed it off until I rolled into town. That's when I understood. The place didn't just look abandoned. It felt lived in by something that wasn't quite human anymore. The deeper I drove, the emptier it seemed. Houses stood with curtains still hanging in the windows, sagging and yellowed, like they'd been left mid-move decades ago. Streetlights lined the road, but most were dead, leaving long stretches of shadow. Every few blocks, I'd pass a structure that felt wrong in ways I couldn't put words to. Churches with boarded doors, barns that leaned at odd angles, and one brick building with shattered glass that looked like eyes watching me. I parked at one point, more out of curiosity than anything. The car engine clicked as it cooled, and in that silence, the air pressed in again. I'd heard rumors before about Rulo, something about a cult, about murders. But I never paid much attention to those kinds of stories. Standing there in the middle of the street, though, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The shadows between the houses stretched too long, like they weren't following the sun but their own rules. And in that stillness, I swore I heard something move. It wasn't footsteps, not exactly. It was more like the shuffle of someone dragging their feet across gravel. I turned toward the sound, but the street behind me was empty. My pulse jumped, and I tried to tell myself it could have been an animal. But when it came again, closer this time, I felt the kind of cold I usually only get when I wake up from a nightmare. I got back in the car fast, slamming the door harder than I meant to. The sound echoed down the street like a gunshot. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the houses had its front door open, just a crack. It hadn't been that way when I parked. I would have noticed because every other door on the block had been shut tight, some even nailed closed. The thought that someone had opened it while I was standing there made my stomach drop. I sat frozen for what felt like forever, staring at that gap. My brain fought to rationalize it. It could have been wind. It could have been that the door was never latched right. But then the door eased open a little wider, and I knew wind didn't move like that. My headlights caught the inside for just a second, just enough for me to see that it was pitch black inside. Not dim, not shadowed, completely black, as though the house swallowed light whole. That was enough for me. I started the car and drove out without looking back. The whole way through town, I kept feeling like something was watching me from the windows, like every abandoned building hid eyes behind the curtains. When I finally hit the main road again, I realized I'd been gripping the wheel so tight my hands ached. Later, I did a little digging and learned about Michael Ryan and the cult that lived there in the 80s. They tortured people, killed them, and left scars on that town you can still feel today. The book Evil Harvest goes into the details, but I didn't need the details. Spending an hour in Rulo gave me the same feeling I imagine those victims must have felt. Trapped, watched, completely powerless. I can't say what really happened when I heard those footsteps or saw that door open. Maybe my nerves made me exaggerate. Maybe the place just plays tricks on your head because you know its history. But I can say this, I'll never set foot in Rulo again. Once was enough. Story 5. Some places fade away like old photographs left out in the sun, their colors draining until there's nothing left but shadows. That's what Yellow Dog, Pennsylvania feels like now. It isn't gone exactly, but it exists in this strange half-life where everything looks like it was abandoned in a single heartbeat. I first knew Yellow Dog through a childhood friend who lived there. Back then, it was just a normal little spot in the middle of nowhere. Their house wasn't anything fancy, just a simple place with a yard full of toys, and I probably stayed there every other weekend for years. It was the kind of town where everyone waved when you drove by, and most of the kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on. Nothing about it seemed unusual at the time, but people started moving out one by one. Families packed up with no real explanation, and my friend's family eventually did the same. After that, I never thought much about the place. It was only years later, when someone mentioned that Yellow Dog was practically empty, that I decided to go back and see it for myself. Driving in, it didn't look like the town had died. It looked like it had been frozen. Houses were still standing, sagging a bit but intact. Mailboxes leaned at the ends of driveways. A swing set creaked in the wind. But there were no kids, no cars, nothing. The silence was the worst part. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there. Like the place is holding its breath, waiting for something you can't see. When I got closer to the houses, that's when it turned from unsettling to creepy. Toys were still scattered in yards, faded by the sun but not broken. Stuffed animals sat slumped in windows, their faces staring out as if watching the road. Inside one house, a dollhouse was tipped over, little plastic chairs and tables still neatly arranged around it. It didn't look looted or trashed. It looked like people had just walked out and left everything behind. I tried to tell myself it wasn't that strange. Maybe the town went downhill fast. Maybe it was too much trouble for families to haul everything out. But the longer I walked through those empty houses, the harder it was to shake the feeling that something else had happened. There were dishes still sitting in sinks, half-burned candles on tables, even a pair of shoes sitting neatly by a door, like someone meant to come back for them. At one point, I stepped into a bedroom that had collapsed a little on one side. The floor creaked under me, and I noticed stuffed animals scattered across the bed. They were lined up facing the same direction, all pointing toward the doorway, as if someone had deliberately arranged them to watch whoever entered. The air in that room was colder than the others, enough that I could see my breath even though it was the middle of summer. That was when I decided I'd seen enough. On the way out, I glanced back at the houses and swore I saw movement behind one of the curtains. It was just the faintest shift, like someone peeking out, and it sent a jolt of fear straight through me. I froze for a second, half expecting to see a face, but the curtain stilled and nothing else happened. I told myself it could have been wind. Curtains move, houses settle, air drafts through cracks. That's the logical answer. But when I left Yellow Dog that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place wasn't empty at all. It felt watched, like whatever forced those families to leave never actually left with them. I don't know if I'd call it paranormal. Maybe it's just the natural eeriness of seeing a whole town abandoned, with the lives of its residents still sitting there in plain sight. But I know this: I've never gone back, and I don't think I ever will. Story 6. Some towns feel like they exist in a different dimension, like you crossed an invisible border without noticing. One minute you're driving through normal farmland, the next you're in a place that feels wrong in a way you can't put your finger on. That's exactly what happened to me in Orange Cove, California, and it's a memory that still leaves me unsettled years later. I had been on my way up toward the Sequoias. I knew the drive well, but that day I wanted to try a new route, something quicker, something that might give me a chance to pull over and take a breather. Traveling with an infant is always unpredictable, so when my phone's GPS showed me a park tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac, I thought it might be the perfect stop. Nothing unusual about it at first glance, just another small-town shortcut. As I turned onto the street leading to the park, though, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Not in any dramatic way, but in those small, creeping details your brain picks up before you consciously register them. Dogs, at least a dozen of them, roamed freely along the road. Not strays either. They had collars, but they weren't tied up, just pacing back and forth like they owned the place. Every house I passed had heavy security, bars on the windows, chain-link fences, gates locked tight, and people were starting to step outside one by one, lingering near their porches or fences, watching my car with flat, unreadable expressions. When I reached the park, I realized it wasn't really a park anymore. The playground was rusting, swings missing, grass tall and overgrown. Broken bottles sparkled in the dirt. It felt abandoned, but not in the peaceful, forgotten way. More like it had been left behind on purpose. Still, I parked and got out, telling myself I'd sit for just a few minutes, catch my breath, and then head back on the road. That's when I noticed the dumpster. It sat sideways across the street, right next to the park, like a barricade. At first, I figured it was just there for trash removal, but the way it was positioned didn't make sense. It blocked the view from the main road. Anyone parked beside it would be hidden. That detail stuck in my head, and the longer I stared at it, the more it felt intentional. I tried to shake it off and sit down at a bench. That's when I saw the graffiti. At first, it was the usual mess, names, crude jokes, the kind of stuff you see on every rundown picnic table. But the more I looked, the darker it got. The drawings weren't random tags. They were specific, detailed. Figures of police officers sketched out, mutilated, some burned, others hanging. The images were violent, too precise to be mindless vandalism. It felt like a warning, like whoever had carved those pictures into the wood wanted to make a point to anyone who stopped there. Right then, a truck rolled up. It drove slowly past the dumpster, then stopped, reversed, and parked directly against it, as though sealing itself in. The placement clicked instantly in my head. That dumpster wasn't random, it was cover. The truck was now completely shielded from anyone who might glance down the street. Two men sat inside. They didn't get out, didn't say anything, just stared in my direction. The air around me changed. That prickling sensation ran up my arms, the one your body sends out when it knows something is wrong before your mind is caught up. My instincts screamed at me to leave immediately. I didn't argue with them. I gathered my things in a hurry and walked back to the car, forcing myself not to look back at the truck. I put the baby in the car without bothering with the seat, shut the door, and slid behind the wheel. My only thought was to get out of that cul-de-sac as fast as possible. As I turned around, I caught movement in my mirror. The truck had pulled out from behind the dumpster and was following. My heart thudded hard enough to make me dizzy, but I focused on the road, speeding back the way I'd come. House after house lined the street, and now it seemed like every one of them had people standing outside. Men, women, kids, even old folks, each of them pressed against their fences, watching, not talking, not moving, just staring as my car rolled past. The truck stayed behind me the whole way, never closing the gap, but never dropping back either. When I reached the main road, I made a quick turn. The truck slowed, then stopped. It didn't follow beyond that point. I kept driving for a few blocks before finally pulling over. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to steady myself. I got out, put the baby properly in the car seat, and tried to breathe. That's when I noticed the street I had pulled onto wasn't much better. It felt empty, like a ghost town, even though I could see curtains shifting in the windows as people peeked out. I pulled out my phone and searched Orange Cove, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What I found made the whole thing worse. At the time, it was listed as one of the densest gang areas in California, with activity that explained the barricades, the graffiti, and the heavy security on every home. I don't know if I stumbled into some kind of gang territory, or if there was something else going on in that park. I don't know if the men in the truck just wanted to scare me, or if the dumpster had been a trap for something worse. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of silent hostility from an entire neighborhood before, and I've never gone back to Orange Cove since. Sometimes I think about how easily things could have gone differently. If I'd lingered longer at the park, if I hadn't noticed the way the truck positioned itself, if I'd hesitated before leaving. There's nothing supernatural I can point to, no ghostly figure or unexplainable shadow. But that town, that street, that park, it all felt wrong in a way I can't shake. Like I'd stumbled into a place I was never meant to see. Story 7. Some towns feel like they exist outside of time. You drive into them, and it's almost like stepping through a doorway into another version of reality, one that doesn't quite line up with everything you know. Carpenter, Wyoming, gave me that exact feeling. It's a dot on the map, so small that if you blink, you're already past it. I wasn't planning on stopping, just cutting through on my way somewhere else. But that short drive through the place left me with something I still think about whenever small towns come up in conversation. The first thing I noticed was how empty it looked. Not quiet in the normal way, like when a neighborhood is napping through a Sunday afternoon, but empty in a way that felt staged, almost wrong. The houses were there, the streets were clean, the air carried that dry, dusty stillness. But I didn't see a single person out on porches, walking dogs, or even working in yards. It gave me that weird sense that maybe I shouldn't be there, like I'd stumbled into a place people had abandoned without telling anyone. As I got closer to the center of town, I saw movement near the town hall. It was a little girl standing completely still, her hands folded in front of her. She wasn't smiling, waving, or even shifting her weight like most kids do when they can't stay still. She just stood there staring directly at me, eyes fixed like she'd been waiting for me to pass. Her head shook slowly from side to side the entire time, almost like she was warning me off. The look on her face didn't match the motion. There was no anger or sadness, just this blank, steady stare that made the gesture feel even more unnerving. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was playing some kind of game. Maybe her parents had told her to stay put, and she was just bored out of her mind. But the longer she held that stare, the more uneasy I felt. There was no curiosity in her eyes, no spark of recognition, nothing childlike about the way she looked at me. It was almost clinical, like she was memorizing me, silently recording the fact that I had been there. I didn't stop. I didn't roll down the window or say anything. I just kept driving, but my hands were tight on the wheel, and every hair on the back of my neck was standing up. The street stayed empty. The silence of the place pressed down heavier the further I went, until I was certain that I needed to get out of there. It felt less like a town and more like a stage set that no one was meant to see in use. On my way out, just when I thought I was done with whatever strangeness Carpenter had thrown at me, I spotted something else. In the yard of a small house near the edge of town, a boy was bouncing a basketball. Unlike the girl, he didn't look at me or act strange. He was focused on his game, dribbling and shooting, the way any kid might on a summer evening. The sound of the ball echoed in the still air, and for a moment, it grounded me. It made the place feel normal again. But even then, there was something off. The ball made no sound when it hit the hoop or the ground, only the hollow thud of the dribble. His movements were repetitive, almost too perfect, like he was stuck in a loop. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it because I was already on edge, but it didn't look like a game being played. It looked like a motion being repeated, like a recording. I tried to shake it off. I told myself small towns have quirks. Kids act weird sometimes. Silence plays tricks on you. But the image of that girl shaking her head slowly at me, as if I wasn't supposed to be there, still unsettles me. It wasn't like she was threatening me. It was worse. It was like she knew something I didn't. Carpenter isn't on any list of haunted towns, at least none I've found. If you look it up, it's just another tiny Wyoming community, quiet and uneventful. But I'll never forget how it felt to drive through. One child staring like a warning, another playing like a broken record, and me in the middle, caught between them and the silence. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I let the emptiness get to me. But to this day, I swear that town didn't want me passing through, and for reasons I'll never understand, that little girl made sure I knew it. Story 8. Some towns carry a silence that feels heavier than others. Not the kind you notice in the countryside or at night, but the kind that seems woven into the air itself, like the streets don't want you to raise your voice. That's what hit me the first time I drove into Cassadaga, Florida. I hadn't even parked my car before the place felt off. It's not somewhere you stumble into. You don't accidentally find Cassadaga while running errands or taking a wrong turn. It sits tucked away about 45 minutes northeast of Orlando, and the only reason I'd even heard of it was through word of mouth. People told me it was known as the psychic capital of the U.S., home to the Cassadaga spiritualist camp, with mediums, fortune tellers, and spiritualists making their living there. It sounded kitschy and harmless enough, the kind of roadside attraction you might wander through for a laugh before grabbing a beer somewhere normal. Except when I got there was nothing funny about it. The first time I went, the streets were so empty it felt staged. Houses lined the road, each one looking older than the next, with faded paint and porches that sagged like they hadn't seen maintenance in decades. There were signs for readings and sessions, little wooden boards nailed up near the doors. but not a single person walked the streets. Not one. I thought maybe I'd picked a dead season, but the stillness was unsettling enough that I didn't stick around long. I should have left it at that. But months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I went back. I wanted to see if the first trip was just bad timing. The second time was no different. If anything, it was worse. I parked in nearly the same spot as before, near a cluster of old houses. The air felt heavier than normal. Humid, sure, it's Florida, but there was something else to it. The second I stepped out of my car, I noticed how quiet everything was. Not a single bird, not even the sound of traffic in the distance. Just this dead, heavy quiet. I walked around for a while. The roads were narrow and twisted in strange ways, almost like they weren't planned, but just grew into whatever shape they ended up. Some homes had their windows covered, others had front doors with strange markings etched into the wood. I caught myself staring at one porch in particular, where rocking chairs sat side by side. They creaked slowly back and forth, though the air was still. The motion was too steady, too deliberate, and I had no explanation for it. When I turned away from that house, I had the sudden, strong feeling that someone was following me. Not in a normal way, more like I was being watched from every direction at once. Every porch, every window, every shadow seemed alive. I glanced behind me more than once, convinced I'd catch someone ducking out of sight, but the road was empty. The strangest part came when I decided to peek into a small gift shop on one corner. The sign outside said open, but when I pushed the door, it wouldn't budge. The glass pane in front reflected my own nervous face at me, but as I leaned in, I swore I caught a second reflection layered behind mine. Just the faintest outline of someone standing over my shoulder, too tall to be me. I spun around, expecting someone to be right there, but of course, there was nobody. That was when I started feeling dizzy. Like the whole town had shifted around me while I wasn't paying attention. Streets that I thought circled back on themselves didn't anymore. And buildings looked like they were in slightly different places than they had been 10 minutes before. At one point, I reached the same crossroad 3 times, even though I thought I'd taken different paths each time. It was like the place was folding in on itself, and I was stuck in the middle of it. I eventually found my way back to my car, though it felt less like I walked there and more like the town finally allowed me to leave. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, and the second I started the engine, the spell broke. Birds started singing again. A car passed on the highway nearby. The air felt normal, light even, like whatever weight had pressed on me evaporated the second I crossed the invisible border. I drove out without looking back, and I've never returned. Skeptics could say I let stories and atmosphere get in my head, and maybe they're right. Maybe I imagined the rocking chairs. Maybe I misjudged the reflections. Maybe the streets only seemed confusing because I was already wound up. But part of me knows the truth. Cassadaga doesn't want visitors, and when you do visit, it watches. Story 9. Small towns can feel like they exist in another dimension. You drive a few miles off the highway, and suddenly it's like the rest of the world doesn't exist anymore. That's exactly the feeling I had when I went looking for a place called Blue Hole in Perryopolis, Pennsylvania. It wasn't marked on maps or anything official. You had to dig through old forum posts or random comment threads where people gave vague instructions like, walk this far past the tracks, or turn left after the second bridge. I'd heard about it for years, and one summer I finally decided to see it for myself. Someone had actually warned me not to bother. He said he'd parked out there once and came back to find his car keyed. He framed it as locals being territorial. I brushed it off. I figured he must have parked like an idiot or annoyed the wrong person. I told myself it was probably just one bad experience, not some ongoing thing. I didn't like being spooked out of trying something I'd wanted to see for so long. Getting there felt strange from the start. The drive was nothing but back roads through thick woods, and as I got deeper in, my signal dropped completely. No bars, no chance of calling anyone if something went wrong. The farther I went, the more isolated it felt. No stores, no houses, no real signs of life, except the occasional broken-down barn or an abandoned-looking trailer. I remember thinking how easy it would be for something to happen out there, and no one would know for days. I parked near the spot where the directions said to start hiking. The place felt quiet, but not in a peaceful way. More like the kind of silence where every crack of a branch underfoot makes you feel like you're too loud. I followed the vague landmarks, passing over the train tracks and heading into the trees. That's when I noticed two guys off in the distance. They weren't hiking or swimming, just standing there. At first I figured they were locals. I nodded at them, kept moving, and didn't think much of it. But then I saw them again. Different angle, different path, but same two guys. It didn't make sense how they'd gotten ahead of me unless they'd been deliberately circling around. I told myself I was imagining it, that they probably just knew the area better and cut across. Still, the feeling of being watched sank in quick. I sped up, trying to follow the directions more carefully, but when I looked back, they were behind me again. Not close, but close enough to make it clear they weren't just out for a casual walk. By then, the sun had started to dip lower, and the woods got darker a lot faster than I expected. Every tree looked the same, and the more I tried to push forward, the more it felt like I was losing the trail. The directions that seemed simple online suddenly felt useless, like someone had intentionally left them vague so outsiders wouldn't actually make it there. Between the two men appearing and disappearing, and the creeping darkness, I decided it wasn't worth it anymore. When I made it back to where I had parked, my stomach sank. The car looked wrong even before I got close. The back window was shattered, glass scattering across the ground. Inside, everything that wasn't tucked away or hidden was gone. Backpack, jacket, even the spare change in the cup holder. Whoever did it hadn't bothered to hide the fact that they'd broken in. It felt deliberate, like a message. You don't belong here. What unsettled me the most wasn't the theft itself. It was the silence. No one around, no cars passing, not even the two men anymore. It was as if the woods had swallowed them whole. I kept thinking about how they'd shown up in different spots along the trail without making a sound, and how conveniently timed their appearances had been. Part of me wanted to believe they were just locals messing with me, but another part of me can't shake the idea that there was something off about them. Something I can't explain? I never did find Blue Hole. I left town with glass crunching under my shoes and the eerie feeling that I'd walked into something I wasn't supposed to. The whole drive back, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those two men following me still. Even now, years later, I can't decide if they were just backwoods bullies protecting their turf, or if something stranger was at play in that stretch of Periopolis woods. Either way, I'll never try going back. Story 10. Some towns feel less like they're alive and more like they're trapped in a photograph, frozen while everything else around them moves on. That's the exact impression I got when I first rolled into Cooperstown, New York. People always talk about how charming and picturesque it is, but to me it didn't feel alive. It felt staged, like I had accidentally driven through some rip in time and landed in the 1950s. The unease started long before I even reached the town. The road leading in wound through dense woods, the kind where your headlights barely seemed to cut through the blackness. The trees pressed in so close that even with the windows rolled up, I felt like they were leaning toward the car. Every twist and turn made my stomach knot, because I kept expecting something to appear. Maybe a deer, maybe a person, maybe something worse. At one point, I even slowed down because I swore I saw a figure between the trees, but when I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was just a shadow or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. Finally, after what felt like forever, the forest opened up and the lights of the town came into view. Cooperstown looked peaceful, quiet, and almost too perfect. The main streets were lined with little shops and old houses converted into bed and breakfasts. I didn't see a single modern hotel chain, which felt strange in itself. Normally, that would have added to the charm, but in the middle of the night, it came across as eerie. The whole place gave me the sense that I'd stepped into someone else's memory, like a stage set from another era. The bed and breakfast I checked into was in one of those massive Victorian houses you see on postcards. From the outside, it looked beautiful. Large front porch, white paint, tall windows. But the moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The smell of old wood and something floral hit me. Not fresh flowers, but that stale perfume smell that lingers on clothing stored away too long. The owner was polite enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was a little too enthusiastic, like she was performing rather than just checking me in. The house itself was cluttered with antiques, Heavy furniture, creaking floorboards, and most unsettling of all, dolls. Not just one or two, but dozens of porcelain dolls scattered on shelves, on nightstands, even on the mantel over the fireplace. Their glass eyes followed you no matter where you moved. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just old decor, but it was impossible to ignore how their painted faces seemed frozen mid-expression, as though they were watching something I couldn't see. I dropped my bag in the room and immediately noticed how uneven the floor felt under my feet. The heater rattled faintly in the corner, but despite being set high, the air had a chill to it, especially near the window. I pulled the curtains shut and tried to relax, but the silence of the house made that difficult. Every sound seemed magnified: the tick of a clock downstairs, the groan of wood under some unseen weight, the faint creak of what sounded like footsteps upstairs. I asked the owner earlier if there were other guests, and she said no. I was the only one. That should have made me feel secure, but instead it just made the noises worse. Later, when I finally lay down, I noticed how restless I felt. The dolls on the dresser faced the bed directly, and even in the dim glow of the lamp, I swore their eyes glinted differently depending on how I shifted. At one point, I thought I heard whispering in the hallway. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound stopped the second I focused on it. A draft slid across my face despite the heater buzzing loudly, and I pulled the blankets tighter around me. The worst moment came when I got up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. As I stepped into the hallway, the air turned noticeably colder. I walked quietly, telling myself not to be ridiculous, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The dolls in the hallway cabinet weren't facing the same direction they had earlier. I didn't want to believe it, but I remembered clearly how they had been turned slightly toward the stairs before. Now they faced straight out, directly toward me. I froze for a long time, staring, waiting for some rational explanation to present itself. Maybe I just misremembered. Maybe the owner had moved them. But why would she in the middle of the night? I hurried back to bed and forced myself not to look around anymore. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, every shadow longer than it should have been. I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. My body wouldn't relax. It was the kind of night where you feel wide awake even though you're exhausted, because some primal part of your brain won't let you fall asleep. When sunlight finally bled through the curtains, everything looked different. The dolls were back to being just inanimate objects. The hallway looked ordinary, and the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen downstairs. The owner greeted me with the same bright tone as before, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I wanted to ask her if she'd heard anything overnight, if she'd been walking around, if she'd moved the dolls. But something stopped me. Maybe it was embarrassment. Maybe it was the quiet smile she gave me, as if she already knew what kind of night I'd had. I left Cooperstown that morning and haven't been back since. The town itself was fine in the daylight, but I can't shake the memory of that night. The cold drafts, the footsteps when I was supposed to be alone, and those dolls that never seemed to stay quite the same. Maybe it was just my imagination, maybe I was overtired, maybe the house just creaks like that. But there's another part of me that wonders if Cooperstown really is frozen in time, and whether for one night I brushed against something that didn't want me there.